The world of Velarn IX was never meant to be a battlefield. It was a mining moon, dull, gray, and loyal. The kind of place that prayed to the Emperor in whispers, where every sunrise brought the promise of hard labor and silent devotion. But all of that ended the day the sky caught fire. It began with a sound. Not thunder, not the shriek of incoming shells, it was deeper. A vibration in the bones, like the world itself was crying out. Sergeant Cale Vorn, 89th Velarn Infantry, felt it before he heard it. The vox in his ear crackled once, then went dead. The sky above the eastern ridge turned from gray to gold, then gold to red, then red to black. "Orbital bombardment," whispered Corporal Janin beside him, voice shaking. "But that's our fleet." Cale didn't answer. He just watched as the heavens split apart. Imperial ships, their hulls marked with the Aquila, drifted in flames, spilling their wrath down upon their own world. Every blast was a blossom of fire that swallowed kilometers of city in an instant. The Emperor's light had come to Velarn IX, but it was not salvation, it was judgment. Hours later, Cale and what remained of his squad moved through the ruins of what used to be Hive. The air was thick with ash. It clung to the tongue, to the eyes, to the soul. Every step was a memory, the marketplace where he'd bought ration bread, gone. The square where children had once recited the Imperial Creed, reduced to molten slag. "Command S gone," said Janin. "The 2nd Regiment's gone. Vox channels are all static." Cale nodded slowly, gaze fixed on the smoldering skyline. He could still see the fires burning in the distance, falling like rain from orbit. "Then we hold," he said finally, "until we know why." But deep down, he already suspected the reason. Velarn IX had been tainted. Somewhere in the depths of the mines, something had been unearthed, a relic, a whisper, a shadow that had twisted minds and hearts. The Inquisition had come, and when the Inquisition comes, worlds burn. Cale had been told it was an honor to die for the Emperor. He had believed it, but as he stepped over the charred remains of a child still clutching a prayer token, he felt the first spark of something else: doubt. By nightfall the bombardment ceased, the fires dimmed, silence fell. That silence was worse than the fire. They found survivors, hundreds of them, wandering aimlessly, eyes wide, muttering prayers to no one. Cale led them toward the old Manufactorum district. The air there was heavy with chemical fumes, but at least the walls still stood. Among the survivors was a woman, Tessara, a Medici apprentice. Her face was burned on one side, her uniform shredded, but her hands were steady as she tended to the wounded. "Sergeant," she said quietly, not looking up, "do you think they'll come for us? Evacuation." Cale didn't answer right away. The truth was cruel, but it was the truth. If the Inquisitions ordered exterminatus, he stopped. The word hung in the air like poison. "Then we're already dead," she finished for him. He nodded once. She didn't cry. She just went back to her work. The next morning, they heard the engines. Thunderhawks screaming through the smoke, gunmetal silhouettes cutting across the crimson dawn. The survivors cried out in joy, until the first drop pod slammed into the street and disgorged black-armored giants. Astartes. Not the shining angels of legend. These bore the sigil of the Inquisition. The black eye of the Ordo Hereticus burned into their pauldrons. Their leader stepped forward, towering over Cale. His voice was a growl of vox-distorted iron. "This world harbors the taint of the warp. All citizens are to be purged. You will comply." Cale's breath caught. "We're loyal," he said. "We fought the cultists. We held the line. There's no taint here." The Astartes turned his helm toward him. For a moment, Cale saw his own reflection in that mirrored visor, ash-covered, trembling, small. "Loyalty means nothing when corruption runs deep," the Space Marine said. Then he raised his bolter. The world became fire again. Cale didn't remember running. Only the sound of Tessara screaming, the thunder of bolter fire, the walls collapsing. He dragged whoever he could, 3 civilians, maybe 4, into a side tunnel that led beneath the manufactorum. The air was chokingly hot, thick with smoke and dust. Above them, the sounds of slaughter echoed like distant drums. He pressed his back to the stone wall, gasping, and looked at the faces around him. Fear, desperation, hopelessness. "We stay quiet," he whispered. "They'll move on. We wait for nightfall." But deep down, he knew there would be no nightfall, not for them. Hours later, the ground shook again, but this time it wasn't orbital fire. It was something beneath them. The tunnels groaned, ancient supports cracking. A smell of ozone filled the air, sharp, metallic, wrong. Janin looked at Cale, eyes wide. "Sergeant, what is that?" Cale opened his mouth to answer, but the floor split apart. A crimson glow spilled upward, and from the depths came a whisper, soft and mocking. "Even now you cling to faith." Cale froze, the civilian screamed. Tessara fell to her knees, clutching her head. The whisper became laughter, cold, echoing, inhuman. The tunnel walls pulsed like veins. Cale fired his lasgun into the fissure, but the beam disappeared into the glow. Whatever they had found in the mines, it was awake now. He realized then why the Inquisition had come, why they'd burned the cities, why they would not stop until Velarn IX was nothing but ash. It wasn't cruelty, it was containment. "Get back," Cale shouted, dragging Tessara to her feet. "Run." They fled through the smoke, the sound of cracking stone following them. The ground collapsed behind them, swallowing the corpses and the screams alike. The light below grew brighter, spreading, reaching, hungering. When they finally burst back into the ruins above, the world was unrecognizable. Half the hive was gone, consumed by a spreading pit of molten red. The sky burned again, this time not from orbit, but from the warp itself bleeding through reality. Cale fell to his knees, staring up at the descending Imperial ships. He could see their bomb bays opening. Tessara grabbed his shoulder. "Cale, they're going to." "I know," he said softly. "They have to." The final bombardment began. And as the light swallowed them, Cale whispered a prayer he no longer believed. Silence. It was the silence that broke him more than the fire ever could. After the light came darkness, thick, endless, suffocating. Sergeant Cale Vorn awoke beneath the ruins of what had once been Hive Murren's manufactorum sector, his armor half melted into his skin, his lungs filled with dust and blood. Every breath was agony, but breath meant life, and life meant he could still serve. He coughed, dragging himself out of the wreckage. The air was acrid and dry, carrying the metallic tang of vaporized stone. Around him, the tunnels had collapsed into a jagged tomb of rebar and broken ceramite. He reached out, groping through the darkness until his fingers brushed against something soft, fabric. He froze, then pulled harder. Tessara. She was barely conscious. Her medici uniform burned black across her side, but she was alive. "Sergeant," her voice was raw like sandpaper. "Where are we?" Cale looked upward. A thin shaft of crimson light bled through the cracks above. "Still under Hive Murren, I think. Emperor, they did it. They burned everything." He nodded slowly, the motion stiff and mechanical. His ears still rang from the bombardment, but in the quiet beneath that ringing, he could hear something else. The faint hum of power conduits still active somewhere deeper in the ruins. That meant air filtration, maybe water, maybe life. "Come on," he said, gripping her arm. "We move. If we stop, we die." They walked in silence through the shattered underhalls, their boots crunching over powdered bone and glass. Cale's mind replayed the images, the falling ships, the black-armored Astartes, the molten chasm that had swallowed the hive whole. He wanted to believe this was the end, that the world had been purged clean. But the air itself seemed to hum with defiance, as if the warp had refused to release its claim. Hours passed, days perhaps. There was no sense of time anymore. They found Janin half buried under a collapsed bulkhead, his legs mangled beyond recognition. He was delirious when Kale pulled him free, mumbling fragments of the Imperial creed between shuddering gasps. Tessara did what she could, but there was little left to save. "Sergeant," Janin whispered, clutching Kale's arm. "You saw it too, didn't you, down there in the cracks?" Kale didn't answer. "It was whispering," Janin continued, voice trembling. "It knew my name, said it could save us, said all I had to do was—" "Enough," Kale snapped. "You didn't hear anything, none of us did." But as he said it, he could still feel the echo in his mind. That same mocking voice from the fissure, soft as a breath, cold as vacuum. "Even now you cling to faith." He closed his eyes and forced the thought away. Faith was all he had left. If that fell, he was nothing. 3 days after the bombardment, they found a way out. A cracked service elevator, its cage warped by heat, still led upward toward the mid-hive levels. Kale forced it open, climbing one-handed with Tessara behind him and Janin strapped to his back. Each step was a battle against pain. When he finally emerged into the light, the world above took his breath away. Hive was gone. Where once there had been towers stretching to the heavens, there was now a crater so vast it swallowed the horizon. The ground glowed faintly with molten glass, and the air shimmered with heat. The sky, if it could still be called that, was a bruised red, streaked with falling debris. What remained of the upper hive had collapsed inward, forming mountains of twisted steel and corpses. Janin wept softly. Tessara just stood beside Kale, staring into the inferno. "The Emperor's light," she whispered. "Is this what it means?" Kale didn't answer. There were no hymns for this kind of salvation. They set up shelter in the ruins of an old transit hub half buried in dust. For days, Kale scavenged what he could. Food rations turned to ash, water filters melted beyond repair. He found a half-functioning Vox unit, but all channels were static. No fleet, no command, no rescue. Only the wind, howling through the broken hive spires like a funeral choir. At night, Kale would see things in the distance, figures moving through the heat haze. Sometimes they looked human, sometimes not. He kept his lasgun ready even while he slept, but the dreams found him anyway. In his sleep, he walked through the tunnels again. The cracks glowed red, and from them rose hands, human hands, thousands of them, reaching, grasping, pleading. Above them stood a shape he couldn't describe, too vast, too terrible. It looked at him with no eyes and spoke in a voice that was not sound but thought. "Why do you mourn what was never yours to keep?" He would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The whispers would linger for hours. A week passed, then another. On the 13th day, they found more survivors, a group of 20 civilians led by a priest. His robes were torn, his face half burned, but his eyes shone with the kind of faith Kale had almost forgotten existed. "Praise the Emperor," the priest cried when he saw them. "We are not forsaken." Kale almost laughed. "You think this is salvation?" "It is test," the priest replied calmly. "The Emperor burns away weakness. Those who endure prove their faith." Tessara glanced between them, uneasy. "And those who don't?" "They were never his to begin with." Kale wanted to argue, but he didn't have the strength. The priest's words were cruel, but they held something he lacked: purpose. And purpose, even false, was fuel enough to keep men alive. So he followed. They moved deeper into the wasteland of what had once been the hive's upper sanctum. The priest spoke of finding a chapel still standing, a holy site untouched by the fire. Hope flickered among the group like a candle. Kale wanted to believe it. Then they found the chapel. It stood at the edge of the crater, its once white spires scorched black, the great aquila above its doors half melted. But somehow, impossibly, the structure remained. The priest fell to his knees, weeping. "He spared his house," he said. Kale stepped forward, weapon raised. Something felt wrong. The air here was colder, heavier. The world around the chapel seemed to hum faintly, as if vibrating with unseen power. He motioned to Tessara to stay back and push the doors open. Inside, the air was still. Candles burned though no one had lit them. The altar was whole, the walls untouched. But beneath the surface of that perfection lay something else. A smell, sweet and rotten. Then he saw it. The icons on the altar were wrong, not broken, shifted. The faces of the saints had melted into new shapes, subtle but unmistakable. Smiles where there should be solemnity. Extra eyes hidden in the folds of sculpted robes. The priest didn't notice, or refused to. He walked to the altar, hands trembling, and fell to his knees. "The Emperor spared this place," he said again. "We must give thanks." Kale grabbed his arm. "Don't." But the priest was already praying aloud, his voice rising with manic devotion. The others joined him, desperate for meaning. The air thickened. The candles burned brighter. Shadows moved along the walls, though there was no wind. Tessara backed away. "Sergeant, something's wrong." Kale raised his lasgun. "Everyone out now." The priest turned toward him, and Kale's blood ran cold. His eyes were glowing. "You doubt," the priest hissed. "Even now you deny his mercy." Then the candles went out. The next moments were chaos, screams, light, the sound of bones breaking. Kale fired into the dark, each flash of the lasgun revealing glimpses of horror. The priest's flesh twisting, the civilians falling to their knees, hands clutching their heads as whispers filled the air. Tessara pulled Kale toward the door. "We can't save them." He didn't argue, they ran. When they finally reached the ruins outside, the chapel behind them was burning, not with ordinary flame, but with cold fire, pale and blue. And through that fire came the sound of laughter. Kale stared, trembling. "He's not here," he said quietly. "The Emperor's not here." Tessara grabbed his shoulder. "Then who is?" That night Kale stood watch while Tessara and Janin slept. The wind carried the smell of ozone and ash. In the distance, the chapel continued to burn, its light flickering across the crater like a heartbeat. He looked down at his lasgun, the weapon that had carried him through 3 campaigns, that had taken the lives of heretics and traitors alike. The metal felt cold now, useless. He thought of the voice he'd heard in the tunnels, of the eyes that watched from behind the veil of fire. And for the first time in his life, Kale wondered if the Emperor's silence had been mercy or abandonment. A sound behind him made him turn. Janin stood there, pale, trembling. His eyes were glassy, his face streaked with tears. "I can hear them again," he whispered. "They're calling my name." Kale stepped forward. "There's no one there, soldier. It's the warp. You have to fight it." Janin shook his head slowly. "They're not the enemy, Sergeant. They're us. They're everyone we burned, everyone we left behind." Before Kale could react, Janin pressed the muzzle of his own las pistol under his chin and fired. The sound echoed across the crater, then was swallowed by the wind. Kale didn't move. He couldn't. Tessara woke moments later, but she didn't scream. She just knelt beside Janin's body and whispered a prayer. Kale looked out at the burning horizon. The world was still on fire, but the light had changed. It was Imperial anymore. It was something else. Something watching. As dawn came, if it could still be called dawn, Kale made a decision. They couldn't stay. If the warp had taken root here, it would spread. And if there was any chance of surviving long enough to warn the Imperium, he had to find a working Vox relay. The old relay towers near the equatorial ridge might still stand. He told Tessara as much. She didn't argue, she just nodded, eyes hollow. They left before the sun rose, though the sky never brightened. The air was colder now, filled with drifting ash that glowed faintly in the dark. Each step carried them farther from the ruins, but not from the memory. Velarn Ix was dead, but Kale was not yet. And in the silence of that dying world, a single truth burned brighter than the fires that had consumed it. Loyalty, even when it destroys you, is still loyalty. He whispered the words like a vow, gripping his weapon tight. Then from somewhere far off, from beneath the ash and ruin, came a sound. Metal marching. Tessara stopped. Kale, tell me you hear that. He did, and his blood ran cold. The Inquisition had returned. But not to save them. The sound grew louder, metallic, rhythmic, not the soft tread of survivors nor the thunder of orbital debris. This was disciplined, deliberate, the march of soldiers. Kale's instincts screamed before his thoughts could catch up. Down, he hissed, pulling Tessara behind the shattered hull of a transport crawler. The ash shifted around them in dull waves as the sound drew closer. Through the haze they appeared, a column of black-armored silhouettes, moving with machine precision. They were not the same as the Astartes who had burned the city. These figures were leaner, their armor less ornate but equally menacing. Red lenses glowed beneath their helmets, and each bore the mark Kale dreaded most, the inquisitorial rosette etched across their breastplates. Stormtroopers of the Ordo Hereticus. The Emperor's hounds. They moved in perfect formation, weapons raised, scanning the ruins. Drones hovered overhead, buzzing like metal insects. Kale could make out their leader by the long, tattered cloak trailing behind him. A man in scorched carapace armor, his face hidden behind a half-mask of gold. He carried no weapon Kale could see, just a staff topped with an iron symbol of the Inquisition. But the air around him shimmered faintly, like heat distortion. Kale had seen psychers before, sanctioned ones, bound and controlled, but this man radiated something colder, more deliberate. Kale mouthed to Tessara, "Don't move." They watched in silence as the inquisitorial unit halted near what had once been a statue square. The golden-masked man knelt, brushing ash from a cracked aquila embedded in the ground. "This was consecrated ground," he said softly, voice echoing through the Vox amplifiers. "And yet, corruption still lingers." A trooper stepped forward. "My lord, sensors show high residual warp signatures, possibly survivors from the cult cells that escaped initial cleansing." The golden mask turned slightly. "Then we finish what was begun." He raised his staff. The ground trembled. Kale gripped his weapon tighter. Every instinct told him to run, but where? The Inquisition didn't miss. They didn't leave survivors. The Imperium had written Velarn IX off, and these men were here to erase the last traces of life that defied the Order. The troopers fanned out, moving methodically through the ruins, planting charges and burning glyphs into the ground with plasma cutters. Kale's heart pounded as one of them approached the wreck he and Tessara were hiding behind. He could hear the trooper's respirator, the low hum of his power pack. Tessara's breath hitched. Kale held her hand down firmly. The trooper stopped, turned. For a moment, Kale thought it was over. Then a new sound cut through the tension, a distant, inhuman shriek that rattled the air itself. The trooper froze, raising his weapon toward the east. "Contact," another voice shouted. "Movement, multiple readings." The golden-masked man didn't flinch. "Hold formation, let them come." The shrieking grew louder, a tide of sound, wrong and layered, like hundreds of voices screaming through the same throat. Through the haze of ash, Kale saw them emerge. Figures shrouded in crimson light, crawling on all fours, their flesh slick with tar-like blood. Former humans twisted by the warp. Cultists? No, not cultists anymore. Warp-spawned remnants of what the world used to be. The troopers opened fire, lines of red Las discharges slicing through the smoke. The creatures fell in heaps, but for every one that burned, two more appeared. The air turned electric as the Inquisitor raised his staff and unleashed a burst of psychic energy that shattered the nearest ruins in a single pulse. Kale and Tessara covered their ears. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, drilling into the skull, scraping against the soul. When it ended, silence returned, broken only by the crackle of residual energy and the slow, wet sounds of dying things. The Inquisitor surveyed the carnage and spoke, calm as if ordering a meal. "Purge Zone 7, leave no remains." The troopers began their grim work. Kale waited until the column moved on before he dared to breathe again. His mind raced. The Inquisition's arrival could mean one thing: there was something still here worth burning. Or something they feared couldn't be burned at all. They moved west after the inquisitorial force disappeared into the fog. Every instinct screamed that the world was finished, but still, some part of Kale refused to stop moving. Maybe it was training, maybe madness. Tessara said nothing for hours. She just followed, pale, eyes hollow. When they finally stopped at the skeletal remains of an old transit station, she sat down beside the rail tracks and stared into the dust. "They were killing the mutants," she said quietly. "They were killing everyone," Kale replied. She turned toward him, anger flashing for the first time since the bombardment. "And we just watched." Kale's jaw tightened. "You think I could stop them? You think one guardsman and a medici can stand against the Inquisition?" "No," she said, "but we could have done something." He looked away. The truth was, she wasn't wrong, but survival had replaced courage long ago. That night they found a working Vox terminal buried under debris in the station's control room. Kale spent hours rerouting power through portable cells, coaxing the old machine back to life. Static hissed from the speaker, then, faintly, a voice. "Any loyal Imperial personnel, repeat, any loyal forces remaining on Velarn IX, rally point confirmed at Sector Kappa 7. By decree of Lord Inquisitor Rassin, survivors are to surrender themselves for purification and transport." The transmission looped. Kale stared at the Vox, then at Tessara. "They're rounding up survivors." "For what evacuation?" He shook his head. "Purification doesn't mean rescue. It means they're making sure no one contaminated leaves this world alive." Tessara swallowed hard. "Then we can't go." "We can't stay either," he said. "If that psychic rot spreads, Velarn IX won't be the only world that dies. Someone has to warn the fleet before they glass the rest of the sector." "How?" she asked. "We can't reach orbit. We can't even see the sun through the smoke." Kale looked toward the horizon, where the faint outline of the comm spire rose through the ash. The last piece of the planet's orbital relay network. "We reach that tower," he said. "We send a warning. Then maybe the Emperor gives us mercy." The journey took 2 days through terrain that no longer resembled anything human. The ground itself was warped, glassy in places, pulsing faintly beneath their boots in others. Shadows moved beneath the surface, like things swimming under ice. Kale avoided looking down too long. The air grew colder, heavier, alive with whispers that seemed to echo his own thoughts back at him in unfamiliar tones. By the second night, Tessara was feverish. Her eyes flicked toward the horizon constantly, as if watching something only she could see. "Kale," she murmured, "I keep hearing it, the voice, the same one from the tunnels." He stopped walking. "Ignore it." "It knows my name," she said. "It says the fire wasn't punishment, it says it was birth." Kale grabbed her shoulders. "It's lying. The warp feeds on the weak, on faith turned inward. Don't listen." She nodded faintly, but he saw the doubt in her eyes. That night he stayed awake while she slept. The fire they built barely burned, the air itself seemed to resist it, and in that half-light Kale saw movement. Not far from their camp, shapes moved between the ruins. Not inquisitorial troopers, not cultists, something else. Figures cloaked in tattered white, their faces hidden behind masks carved from bone. Each carried a relic, fragments of aquilas, torn banners, broken icons. Kale raised his weapon, heart hammering. The nearest one stopped and lifted a hand, palm open in peace. "We mean no harm," a voice said, human, trembling. "You are faithful, are you not?" Kale hesitated. "Who are you?" "Survivors like you. We follow the true faith now, the one that endures even after the flames." Tessara woke at the sound and stepped beside Kale. The speaker removed his mask. Beneath it was a man no older than 30, his face streaked with soot and ritual ash. "The Imperium burned us," he said, "but the Emperor's shadow still walks among us. You've seen it, haven't you? The light beneath the world." Kale's blood ran cold. He knew that light. He'd seen it in the tunnels. The red glow, the whispers. "You're not faithful," he said. "You're corrupted." The man smiled sadly. Faith and corruption are two sides of the same truth. When the Imperium abandons you, only the fire remains. The others behind him murmured in agreement, their whispers rising into a low chant that made the air shiver. Kale raised his lasgun. "Stay back." But the man didn't stop. He stepped closer, unafraid. "Why fight it, guardsman? You already know your world is dead. Join us. Help build something purer from the ashes." The chanting grew louder. Tessara grabbed Kale's arm, whispering, "Kale, don't." He fired. The beam took the man through the chest. He fell without a sound. The others screamed and rushed forward, their chanting turning to fury. Kale and Tessara ran. Bolts of red light scorched the ruins behind them. They didn't stop until their lungs burned and their legs failed them. When they finally collapsed beneath the shattered spine of the calm spire, Kale turned toward Tessara. She was crying silently, her hands shaking. "They believed," she whispered. "They believed in something, even if it was wrong, and we just killed them." Kale didn't answer. He looked up at the spire above, the last connection between this dying world and the Imperium that had set it ablaze. He had to reach it, even if it killed him. The climb was brutal. The spire's interior was half melted, its ladders twisted into slag. Kale used power cables and broken struts to haul himself upward, Tessara following close behind. Every gust of wind made the structure groan. Halfway up he heard it again, that same whisper from below the earth. But this time it wasn't mocking. It was pleading. "Why do you suffer for those who burned you? We can give you peace. We can make the pain end." He clenched his teeth, kept climbing. At last they reached the relay chamber. The equipment was ancient, rusted, but still humming with faint power. Kale dropped to his knees beside the control panel, ripping open access hatches and rerouting power conduits. Sparks flew. The Vox emitter whined. "Come on," he muttered, "just once for them." The machine flickered to life. A burst of static filled the air, then a tone. Connection established. Kale keyed the mic, voice shaking. "This is Sergeant Kale Vorn, 89th Velarn Infantry. Velarn IX is lost. Repeat, the world is lost. Warp breach confirmed. Inquisitorial forces are executing full purge. Do not enter orbit. Containment impossible." The signal cut out. A shadow fell across him. He turned and froze. The golden mask was there, standing in the doorway of the relay chamber, the Inquisitor's cloak fluttering in the rising heat. "You should not have done that," the Inquisitor said softly. Tessara gasped, raising her sidearm, but the Inquisitor merely raised one gloved hand. The air shimmered. Her weapon exploded in her grasp. Kale stepped between them. "If you're here to kill me, get it over with, but the fleet needs to know." "The fleet already knows," the Inquisitor interrupted. "They have known since the first flame fell. This world was condemned the moment it touched the warp. Every word you've just spoken will be erased." Kale's hand shook. "Then why come back?" "To make sure nothing leaves this place," the Inquisitor said. "Not even hope." And then the world itself seemed to roar. The ground quaked. The spire shuddered violently. Kale staggered as the walls cracked open, spilling crimson light into the chamber. The Inquisitor turned sharply, his mask tilting toward the horizon. The crater below was glowing again. Something beneath Velarn IX was waking. The Inquisitor looked back at Kale. "You've done enough damage, guardsman." He lifted his staff and the world went white. When Kale opened his eyes, he was lying on the edge of the spire, the relay tower split in half. Tessara was beside him, blood running from her temple. The Inquisitor was gone. The crater below blazed with light, brighter than the sun, and from it rose something vast, a storm of fire and ash and screaming light. Kale grabbed Tessara's hand and whispered, "Don't look." But she already was. And in her eyes, reflected against the burning sky, he saw something that froze his heart. Not fear, not pain. Recognition. The world was burning. Not metaphorically, not in poetry or in whispered dread. The heavens themselves were aflame, bleeding fire that streaked across the clouds like the lashes of an angry god. It began at dawn, when the void shields cracked. The first orbital bombardment hit the upper atmosphere, and the light of it turned night to day and day to something worse. Those who looked up saw the shape of the Emperor's wrath. Dozens of lance strikes raining down like golden knives, their impact points blooming into thunderous waves that rolled across continents. Governor Halbrecht watched from the command spire of Bastion Varn, his world's last functioning fortress city. Around him, the sky shimmered with the mirrored glow of defense shields, flickering under the sustained assault. The Vox was filled with screams, static, and reports that all meant one thing: the Imperium had judged his world wanting. "Status," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Primary shield integrity at 28%, barked Lieutenant Cashin, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "We've lost contact with the northern hives. The southern defense grid is gone, sir. Nothing's coming back from there." The governor turned away from the viewport. He knew what Cashin wasn't saying. There wasn't anything left to defend. The Imperial Navy had come, and the planet's fate was sealed. In the dim light, he could see the faces of his staff, men and women who had served him loyally for decades, now stripped of sleep, hope, and color. Behind them, the golden Aquila banners fluttered in the artificial wind. The same symbol that had inspired generations now seemed to glare at them, its wings spread in judgment. "Open the Vox link," Halbrecht said, voice steady but soft. "Planetary frequency." Cashin hesitated. "Sir, the network's degraded." "Do it." The lieutenant obeyed. Moments later, Halbrecht's voice echoed across the world, carried by the last functioning transmitters that still clung to life amid the destruction. His words reached soldiers in the trenches, refugees crammed into tunnels, and priests in shattered chapels. "This is Governor Halbrecht," he said, his tone grim yet commanding. "By the Emperor's will we are judged, but we are not broken. We are his servants still, even in our dying. Hold fast. Protect the innocent. If we must burn, we burn for him." For a moment there was silence across the battered city. Then, from somewhere deep below, came the faint sound of thousands of voices shouting as one. "For the Emperor." The cry rose again and again, spreading through the fortress like fire through dry grass. Halbrecht felt tears sting his eyes, not of fear but of pride. Outside, the bombardment intensified. On the outer walls, Captain Lyra Sorin led the 12th Bastion Guard. Her armor was scorched, her bolter slick with ash and blood. She had lost half her company in the last 3 hours. The air was hot, filled with the metallic tang of ozone and the stench of burned promethium. "Reload," she barked, ducking behind a ruined emplacement as another lance beam carved a molten scar through the wall above. The soldiers obeyed, hands shaking, eyes hollow. She looked toward the horizon and saw the impossible. The sky was opening. Massive dropships, Imperial dropships, were descending through the firestorm. Their hulls bore the sigil of the Aquila. One of her men, a young corporal named Dren, stared up in disbelief. "They're ours." Lyra's throat tightened. Not anymore. When the first wave landed, it wasn't the traitors or the Xenos that emerged. It was the Adeptus Astartes. Space Marines of the Imperial Fists, their yellow armor blackened by re-entry, their purity seals fluttering like banners of flame. They moved with mechanical precision, silent as statues. Behind them marched the Skidari cohorts, their red robes whipping in the wind. By decree of the High Lords of Terra, one of the Astartes thundered, his voice amplified through his helm. This world is condemned. Evacuation of Imperial personnel is complete. Exterminatus is authorized. Lyra froze. No, there are civilians still, millions in the underhives. The Astartes' helm turned toward her. The Emperor protects. Their sacrifice ensures purity. Then came the signal. The skies bloomed with light. Orbital torpedoes screamed downward, each one the size of a cathedral, carrying payloads of cyclonic warheads. Lyra fell to her knees as the horizon turned white. Deep beneath Bastion Varn, the refugees huddled in silence. Among them was Father Lucian, an old confessor whose faith had not wavered even when the heavens fell. He held a small child in his arms, whispering prayers over her trembling head. "Fear not, little one," he murmured. "The Emperor sees all even now." The ground shook violently. Dust fell like snow. Somewhere far above, the surface was being torn apart. The tunnels groaned as if the planet itself were crying. Then, through the static of his old vox bead, Lucian heard the governor's voice again, broken, faint, but resolute. "For the Imperium, for the light that endures, stand until the last." Lucian smiled sadly. "He kept his oath," he whispered. "So shall we." He began to sing an old hymn, his voice low but steady. Others joined in, soldiers, children, the wounded. Their voices filled the dark, rising in defiance of oblivion. The shockwave hit moments later. In orbit, aboard the flagship Sanctis Vow, Chapter Master Dornus of the Imperial Fists watched the planet crack open through the viewing bay. Fire blossomed across its surface, vast enough to be seen with the naked eye. One of his lieutenants approached. "Exterminatus complete, my lord. The heresy is purged." Dornus did not answer at first. His eyes were fixed on the dying world below. "Prepare the record," he said at last. "Mark it as compliant." The lieutenant hesitated. "Compliant, my lord. There are no survivors." Dornus turned, his face unreadable beneath his helm. "Then it is pure." Yet deep within the dying world, not all was ash. Beneath the collapsed tunnels of the southern hive, Lyra Sorin clawed her way from beneath the rubble. Her armor was shattered, lungs burning, ears ringing from the blast. She coughed blood and looked around. Nothing but blackness and heat. Then a voice, weak, broken, but human. "Captain." She crawled toward the sound. There, half buried under a beam of ferrocrete, was Dren. His arm was twisted, his face pale. "Still alive," she rasped, almost laughing. "Emperor be praised." Dren tried to smile. "Did we hold the line?" Lyra looked upward. Through a crack in the roof, she saw the light of the fires above, the final embers of a dying sky. "Yes," she said softly, "we held it." The ceiling rumbled again. More debris fell. Lyra shielded the corporal with her own body. "Captain," Dren whispered, "will they remember us?" Her voice broke as she answered. "They always do. The Imperium forgets nothing." But in her heart, she knew the truth. Their names would vanish into the void like so many before. Their sacrifice would be recorded as a single line in some forgotten archive, world rendered compliant by imperial decree. As the air grew thin, Lyra closed her eyes. The hymn of Father Lucian echoed faintly in her mind, mingling with the sound of distant thunder. For the Imperium, for the Emperor, for a world that no longer existed. Above, in the cold silence of space, the last pieces of the planet broke apart, scattering into the void like glowing embers. And so ended the world of Bastion Varn. A world that had loved the Imperium more than itself. A world that had died to prove its loyalty. But somewhere in the immaterial currents of the warp, something stirred, something that remembered. For every world that burns, every soul that screams its devotion to the Emperor leaves a mark upon eternity. And Bastion Varn's mark was far from finished. Silence. Not peace, Not rest, silence. It lay heavy and unnatural over the remains of Bastion Varn. The fires that had once devoured the sky had long since burned themselves out, leaving a smoldering skeleton of a world adrift in its own dust. The atmosphere was gone, stripped bare by cyclonic detonation. The seas had boiled, the cities reduced to glass and carbon. From orbit it looked serene, a dull sphere of gray, lifeless perfection. But beneath the crust, something moved. Deep within the ruins of Hive Varn Primaris, a faint pulse of light flickered in the darkness, a survival beacon, ancient and stubborn. It blinked through the rubble like a heartbeat that refused to die. Captain Lyra Soren woke to that faint light. Her throat was raw, her armor sealed only by emergency systems. She could taste blood, feel the crushing weight of debris around her. For a moment she didn't know where or even when she was. Only when her visor display flickered back to life did she remember. The bombardment, the exterminatus, the fall. She was supposed to be dead. Her first breath was agony. Her second was disbelief. "Status," she croaked. The Vox gave a garbled reply, her helmet AI half-corrupted, still functioning. Life signs minimal. Oxygen 4%. Temperature 62 degrees C and rising. She gritted her teeth. Survivors. The AI hesitated, unconfirmed. She forced her way upward through the debris, her armor servos whining in protest. The rubble shifted, metal screeched, dust cascaded in choking clouds. After long minutes, she broke through into a cavernous hollow, an ancient maintenance level far below the city's lowest habs. It was lit by dying lum globes, their light flickering like candles in a tomb. And there she froze. Figures, dozens of them, people. They were huddled in the shadows, gaunt, burned, barely breathing, but alive. The first to see her gasped, "Saints preserve us." Lyra stumbled forward, disbelief giving way to purpose. "Who's in charge here?" An old man limped from the group, his robe scorched, his eyes blazing with a kind of serene madness. Father Lucian. Somehow, impossibly, he lived. "Captain Soren," he rasped, bowing his head. We prayed that someone from the surface still drew breath." The Emperor answered. Lyra shook her head. "No one could have survived up there. The surface is gone, there's nothing left." Lucian smiled faintly. "And yet here we stand. Perhaps his plan isn't finished with us." She wanted to argue, to tell him there was no plan left, no world, no rescue, but she saw the faces behind him. Children, wounded soldiers, ragged civilians. They had endured the unendurable. The last survivors of Bastion Varn. Over the next few hours, Lyra assessed their situation. The tunnels they occupied were sealed under layers of collapsed ferrocrete. The air recyclers were still functioning, but barely. Food was scarce. Ration bars, fungus stores, and what little water condensed from the coolant pipes. "We can't stay," Lyra said at last. "We'll run out of air within weeks. We have to find a way to reach the surface." Lucian nodded slowly. "If there is a surface left to reach." "There is always a surface," she replied, her tone hardening. "Even if it's ash and glass, I'll get these people topside." She rallied the remaining soldiers, barely 24 of her company. Together they began clearing a path upward, using meltacutters and power tools salvaged from the maintenance bays. Every strike of metal against stone echoed through the tunnels, a heartbeat of defiance against annihilation. But as the hours turned to days, something else began to echo back. At first they thought it was the shifting of the earth, a low tremor, a distant vibration, but then came the voices. Whispers. Soft, indistinct, yet unmistakably human. Lyra froze mid-swing one night, sweat dripping down her brow. "Did you hear that?" Corporal Dren, still pale and half-healed, looked up from his tool. "Hear what?" She waited. The sound came again, faint, like someone speaking just beyond the range of understanding. "Voices," she said. "There are people further in." Lucian frowned. "Captain, we have searched every direction. There are no other survivors." Lyra didn't answer. She started walking toward the sound, deeper into the tunnel. The whispers grew clearer, a language she didn't recognize, melodic, mournful, like prayer twisted into lament. Her armor's vox registered nothing. No frequency. No transmission. Yet the voices were there, around her, inside her. She turned a corner and froze. There, carved into the rock, was a symbol. It glowed faintly with blue-white light, an imperial aquila. But beneath it someone had etched new words, crude and recent. "We burn so others may live." Lyra stared, breath shallow. "Captain," Dren called from behind her. She didn't reply. The stone beneath the sigil pulsed once, faintly. She touched it, and the world seemed to tilt. She was standing somewhere else. A vast plain of ash stretched to the horizon, lit by a blood-red sky. Around her were silhouettes, thousands of figures kneeling, praying toward a blinding light in the distance. Their voices were the same whispers she had heard in the tunnels. "Who are you?" she called. One of the figures turned. It was Lucian, or something wearing his face. "We are those who burned for the Imperium," it said softly, "and we are not forgotten." The light in the distance grew brighter. A shape began to form within it, tall, armored, radiant, the outline of a man or something greater. Lyra shielded her eyes. "The Emperor," she whispered. The figure did not answer. Instead, a voice, not from it but from everywhere, echoed through the burning air. "Witness what devotion becomes." The ground cracked. From beneath the kneeling figures rose pillars of fire, consuming them, fusing them into the earth itself. Their prayers became screams, their flesh into molten glass. Yet even as they burned, they kept kneeling, faces turned toward the light. Lyra fell to her knees, horror twisting her stomach. "Stop, please stop." The light dimmed, the plane vanished. She was back in the tunnel, gasping for air. Her hand still rested on the carved aquila, now cold and lifeless. Lucian was beside her, his expression calm but knowing. "You saw them, didn't you?" Lyra nodded weakly. "What was that?" "The echo of faith," he said. "This world's soul. The Emperor's light leaves traces where devotion burns brightest. Perhaps he has not abandoned us after all." Over the next several days, the whispers returned often. Some claimed they were angels guiding them. Others said they were the dead, bound to the world by their sacrifice. Lyra didn't know which to believe. But every time she touched the carved symbols that appeared throughout the tunnels, each bearing that same phrase, "We burn so others may live," she felt something stir inside her. Strength, clarity, resolve. Even as her body weakened, her purpose sharpened. She began to understand. Survival was not the Emperor's gift. It was his test. Weeks passed. The air grew thin, the lights dim. And then one night the ceiling above their excavation cracked, and a beam of pale light spilled through. "Emperor, guide us," Dren whispered. "We made it." Lyra climbed first. The surface awaited. When she emerged, her breath caught in her throat. The world was gone. An endless desert of ash stretched in every direction. The sun was a cold ember, the horizon lined with broken mountains of blackened stone. The remnants of hive towers jutted from the dust like tombstones. The air shimmered with heat and static. Yet amid that deathly stillness, the light of the Emperor's symbol burned faintly on every ridge, carved into every surviving structure. Lucian emerged beside her, tears in his eyes. "He was here," he murmured. Lyra stared at the horizon, where a single Imperial lander, scarred, ancient, lay half buried in glass. "Then he left us a path." The survivors moved toward it, their shadows long against the dead plain. Inside the wreckage, they found records, Imperial archives, data cores, sealed Vox orders. Most were corrupted, but one fragment remained intact. A message. "Designation, Bastion Varn," the machine voice said. "Status, exterminatus complete, Purity confirmed. Recommend memorial classification. Lucian listened in silence. When it ended, he bowed his head. Memorial classification, he repeated softly. They turned our death into a story. Lyra clenched her fists. Then let's make it a story worth remembering. She turned toward the survivors. We rebuild, here, now, not for vengeance, not for pity, for faith. The others stared at her, hungry, broken, yet listening. We will raise a beacon, she said, her voice rising. A flame they will see from the void. So when the next Imperial ship passes, they will know that Bastion Varn still stands. The survivors began their work. They gathered metal wiring fuel cells. They built in silence, guided by a strength none could explain. Every night the whispers returned, soft, reassuring, almost proud. When the beacon finally flared to life, its golden light pierced the darkness like a single tear of hope against the black. Far above, aboard a passing Mechanicus vessel, a tech priest noticed the anomaly. Unregistered signal detected, he reported, his mechadendrites twitching. Source, Exterminatus World, Bastion Varn. His superior turned. Impossible, that world is ash. The tech priest hesitated. And yet the signal reads pure, machine code uncorrupted, faith parameter maximum. The superior's lenses narrowed. Transmit coordinates to Terra. Below, Lyra stood before the shining beacon, wind whipping her tattered cloak. They'll come, Dren said softly. They'll have to, Lyra replied. The Imperium never ignores its dead. Lucian smiled faintly. Then perhaps, Captain, our world has one last prayer to offer. Lyra looked up at the sky, cold, gray, endless. We're not done yet, she whispered. Not while the Emperor still watches. The beacon's light burned brighter, cutting through the gloom, reaching out to the stars. Somewhere impossibly far away, something answered. It began as a shimmer in the sky. A faint glint, like a falling star that refused to vanish. The survivors of Bastion Varn saw it while standing before their beacon, its golden light burning strong against the ash horizon. For days they had waited, prayed, and watched, their hope bound to that solitary flare that pierced the dead sky. When the glint appeared, faint but steady, a murmur swept through the crowd. Something's out there. Captain Lyra Soren stared upward, her visor magnifying the shape. At first, she thought it was a meteor, a shard of debris drawn back by the planet's gravity. But then she saw the metallic geometry, the faint pulse of thruster fire. A ship. Not large but real, and descending. Kara's hesitated, that perhaps the Emperor had other plans. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The adepts ran diagnostics, mapping radiation pockets and data corruption. Kara's took statements, recorded testimonies, and cataloged the survivors, barely 200 souls. Lucian watched it all from the edge of the beacon platform, his old hands clasped in prayer. When Kara's approached him, the confessor looked up with calm eyes. So, Lucian said softly, you've come to reclaim what was lost. Kara's frowned. We've come to record a miracle. Lucian smiled faintly. Miracles are for the faithful, records are for the fearful. Kara's didn't reply. Inside the ship's medbay, Lyra sat under the cold light of auspex scanners while servitors patched her armor. She stared at her reflection in a cracked piece of plasteel, eyes sunken, skin pale, hair matted with ash. She looked like one of the dead the Imperium forgot. Captain, Kara said quietly, entering the chamber. We've transmitted your situation to Terra. They are debating what to do. She turned, debating. He nodded. Your survival challenges the record. Bastion Varn was marked as purified. To acknowledge your existence is to admit error. Lyra's expression hardened. Error. To the administratum, perhaps. To others, heresy. She rose to her feet, slow but steady. Then they'll erase us again. Perhaps, he met her gaze, Or perhaps they'll see what I see. And what's that? A world that refused to die. The Mechanicus adepts discovered more anomalies as they dug deeper beneath the ash. The soil itself was changing. Threads of radiant material, crystallized fragments that emitted faint luminescence. Samples showed traces of bioenergy, residual psychic resonance. Faith made matter, one adept whispered in binary, almost awed. The planet is singing. Lucian called it the Emperor's grace. The echo of souls burned in devotion, fused into the crust. Lyra called it the world's memory. Karas called it impossible. But even he couldn't deny the evidence. The longer they remained, the stronger the readings grew. Machines malfunctioned near the beacon. Auspex displays filled with static that formed shapes, faces, words, prayers. The dead were not silent here. One night while the survivors slept, Lyra stood alone at the beacon's base. The wind had stilled. The air was thin and bitter. She placed her hand on the metal and whispered, "We're still here. You hear that, don't you?" The beacon pulsed once faintly. And she heard it, not with her ears but deep inside her mind, a calm, vast presence like the memory of sunlight. Faith endures. She dropped to one knee, trembling. "Emperor." There was no answer, only the soft hum of light. But she felt something she had not felt since before the fires, peace. Days later, the order came from Terra. Karas read it aloud to Lyra and Lucian in the ship's command chamber, his voice heavy. By decree of the Segmentum High Lords, the event at Bastion Varn is to be classified as divine manifestation, category Omega. Survivors are to be transported to the Scola Progenium for debriefing and assessment. Planet to remain sealed under ecclesiarchal custody. Lucian exhaled slowly. Divine manifestation, a phrase for what they cannot explain. Lyra shook her head. They'll bury it under parchment and ink. Perhaps, Lucian said, but they cannot bury faith, not truly. Karas hesitated before adding, there's more. The Emperor's tarot was consulted. The result was clear, light reborn in the ashes. The old priest smiled faintly. Then let us be that light. Before departure, Lyra gathered the survivors at the beacon for one final prayer. The storm had cleared, revealing stars overhead, the same stars that had once looked down upon their dying. This world gave everything, she said, her voice carrying across the plain. We gave our homes, our children, our lives. The Imperium called us lost, but we were not lost. We were found in faith, in fire, in each other. She placed her gauntlet on the beacon. Let this stand as proof that the Emperor does not abandon. He tests, and through the test, we become his will. The survivors knelt. Even the Mechanicus adepts bowed their heads in silence. Lucian raised his hands. In fire we were judged. In ash we were reborn, the Emperor watches. The beacon flared one last time, brighter than ever before, lighting the desolate horizon with golden fire. When it faded, the Mechanicus sealed the site under a sanctified dome of adamantium and glass. It would become known, centuries later, as the Shrine of the Burning Faith. Aboard the returning vessel, Lyra stood at the viewport as Bastion Varn shrank into a gray orb. Karas joined her quietly. The ecclesiarchy will make you a saint, you know. She smiled faintly. They'll make me a story. Saints are for the dead. And what are you? Alive, she said simply. That's enough. He nodded, but as he turned to leave, she added softly, when you write your report, Lieutenant, don't say we were saved. He paused. What should I say? Say we believed. Months passed. The survivors were resettled, questioned, studied. Lyra found herself before endless lines of parchment and robed figures who sought to dissect the meaning of faith, but none of it mattered. What mattered was what they left behind. Years later, pilgrims would travel across the stars to kneel before the shrine of the burning faith. They would press their hands to the glass dome, feeling the warmth that never faded. They would whisper prayers, and sometimes, if they listened closely, they would hear the faint echo of voices beneath the surface, still singing the hymns of Bastion Varn. They would call it a miracle, but those who knew the truth would call it something else. A promise that even in the darkest void, even when the Imperium itself forgets you, the Emperor remembers. Always. Decades later, on the eve of another war, a young Imperial guardsman stationed on a distant world knelt before a chapel's relic. It was small, a shard of glass etched with the aquila, glowing faintly with inner light. He had heard the stories, that it came from a world that burned for the Imperium and refused to die. He didn't know the name, few did. But when he whispered his prayer, he felt a warmth on his hand, a presence quiet, unwavering. And for a moment, he felt no fear. Far beyond the veil of reality, in the timeless stillness where mortal voices fade, something vast and golden stirred. It did not speak, but its light rippled across the immaterium like the faintest breath of dawn. A memory of a world that burned, of souls that sang as they died, of faith that endured through the fire. For the Imperium, for the Emperor, forever.